We're good to go.
Thank you. This is a summary review hearing for Stack Bar for the Mall Ealing W5 2PJ. So welcome to today's hearing. My name is Councillor Ball and I shall be chairing the hearing. My colleagues, Councillor Baclini, Councillor Nagpal and I comprise today's subcommittee for this expedited review hearing. Oyemi Davis is the legal advisor to the subcommittee. Also present is Sean O'Brien, who is the clerk to the subcommittee and will be minuting the meeting. In accordance with procedure, I shall invite the police to present the application for a review hearing and call any witnesses in respect of whom permission to appear has been given and answer any questions put to them. Then invite the premises to make their representations and to answer any questions. And finally, invite the parties to briefly sum up their respective cases. At the end of the hearing, the subcommittee, accompanied by the legal advisor and the committee clerk, will retire to consider its decision. The decision will be given at the end of the meeting and confirmed in writing as soon as possible. If I could just ask everyone to briefly introduce themselves. So PC Hewson.
Good morning, Chair. Vicky Hewson, police officer on the licensing team at Ealing. And
good morning, Chair. Sergeant Dimitri Kassar with the police licensing team from Ealing.
Thank you. And Mr. Soleimani.
Good morning, Chair. Armin Soleimani, Counsel for the Metropolitan Police.
Thank you. Mr. Pogjoji.
Good morning, Chair. DPS Mr. Bajirji, the DPS Premises Supervisor.
Mr. Dowding.
Ryan Dowding, Counsel on behalf of the premises.
Great, thank you. So can I first invite the police, so it would be Mr. Soleimani to present the application for a review.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, the police are seeking a suspension of this license as an interim step pending the full review in up to 4 weeks' time. The basics of this incident is that the premises license holder, who's also the designated premises supervisor, is alleged to have inflicted grievous bodily harm on 2 of his patrons, knocking them unconscious with punches to the head and failing to call the police or ambulance afterwards. It is the firm view of the police that a suspension is the minimum necessary step required at this interim stage for the next few weeks to uphold the licensing objectives, particularly the prevention of crime and disorder. When we're dealing with a premises license holder and DPS who's alleged to have inflicted serious harm and behaved in this reckless way, simply no other measure would do. No change of conditions would be sufficient to protect the public. Now, there are 3 reasons we're seeking this, that we've made this application. The GBH that took place was in itself very serious and could have resulted in much more severe consequences. Secondly, the premises license holder and DPS behaved in an extraordinary reckless way, both by inflicting this violence and by failing to call the police or an ambulance afterwards. And finally, we've simply lost trust as a result of this instance. We do not trust this person to be running a bar for the next few weeks until we have the final hearing. So I'll begin with the first reason, which is the severity of the crime. Now, you've read our application and you've read the supplementary 2-page evidence that the police has given the narrative explanation of the CCTV, so you'll know what happened. And I'll try and keep this brief. But essentially, a patron did not want to leave the bar when he was told to. He was with a friend who tried to calm him down. Angry words were exchanged between this patron and the premises license holder, who was also himself backed up by a friend. Both the premises license holder and his friend are described as very large men in the papers. There was rudeness, there was aggression. The premises license holder pushed the 2 men out of his premises, and the police very fairly described this as reasonable force at this point in pushing them out of the premises. When they're out on the premises, there's more aggression, more rudeness. 2 men are out on the streets. On the street, the premises license holder and his friend are in the doorway. Eventually, the PLH comes out of the doorway and punches both of these individuals straight in the head with sufficient force to knock them both unconscious onto the ground. Afterwards, he closes the door, locks the shutters, goes back inside, and with the other friends of his, with his other patrons in the bar, he leaves by the fire exit in the back entrance. He doesn't check on these men. He doesn't call the police. He doesn't call an ambulance. He leaves 2 men at 1:30 a.m. knocked out, stone cold unconscious on the street. He didn't seem to care if they lived or died. A member of the public, 6 minutes later, called the police and the ambulance. They were rushed to hospital. The police and the ambulance service were very worried these people would have serious brain injuries or worse for obvious reasons. Helicopter emergency services were called given the severity of this potential injury. Fortunately, they haven't had any serious brain injuries or serious injuries inflicted as a result of the GBH. My understanding is that the current status of the investigation is the premises license holder will be interviewed tomorrow on his return from holiday by the police. Now, Chair, in light of all that, I think it is quite obvious why the police are seeking this review. This was a very serious assault, a very serious grievous bodily harm. And we have a PLH who's behaved unacceptably in 3 ways. He's inflicted serious and unjustified violence on his customers. He's behaved recklessly in failing to call the police or an ambulance when these men were so clearly injured. And indeed, he breached a crucial condition of his license, condition 30, which requires him to call the police whenever there's been a serious assault and to call an ambulance service. He didn't do that. He didn't stay within the terms of his license. Now, Chair, you'll note that this was a very serious incident. The injuries could have been much worse. We are very lucky that we are not conducting this meeting under the shadow of a serious brain injury or even a fatality, which is entirely possible when someone is punched in the head with sufficient force to knock them stone cold unconscious in one blow. But even more shocking than that crime was that failure to call the police or the ambulance service. There's a shocking level of recklessness and unacceptable behavior from a premises license holder and a designated premises supervisor. The idea that someone who is designated as the person who this authority and the licensing regime trusts to maintain the licensing objectives, the idea that someone would knock 2 people unconscious, just leave them in the street, not bother to call the police, and leave it to a member of the public to hopefully happen across them so they can get the medical help they need, is shocking. It falls so far below the standards we would rightfully expect of a premises license holder or a DPS. And of course, there was that condition breach of the license. Chair, there is really not much more to say than that. This was a shocking incident. The behavior that happened after the violence was shocking too. We don't think that the violence was legitimate or justified. He behaved reasonably in pushing the people out of his venue, but when he was in the doorway, he should have just closed the door. He should have just locked it, closed the shutters, left those men on the street, and not inflicted serious violence on them. That was an unacceptable escalation and incredibly poor behavior from a PLH. For all those reasons, clearly something has gone seriously wrong. Clearly, this is not someone who should be running a bar. Clearly, it poses serious risks to licensing objectives of preventing crime and disorder for this person to continue running a bar. And it's important to remember, running a bar in Ealing is a serious responsibility. A bar is a high-risk premises because it attracts drunk people, it attracts bad behavior. You need people in place who are able to control that, who are able to manage that. You cannot allow a premises license holder and designated premises supervisor who escalates violence, who inflicts serious violence on his customers, and then is so reckless as to not bother to call the police or an ambulance service when that happens in breach of his conditions to run a place like that. It poses an unacceptable risk to the public. For all those reasons, it is the Met's firm view that on an interim basis, at least for the next few weeks until we have the final hearing, we need this license to be suspended. We can't do anything else. Changing the conditions, something like that wouldn't help because we'd still have the same person in charge. And the fundamental problem here is that this person is reckless, he's behaved in a dangerous way, and we don't trust him. A suspension for the next few weeks is the minimum we think is required to protect the public. So for all those reasons, the Met asks for an interim suspension. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Soleimani. Do you wish to call the police officers as witnesses?
I'm happy for the police to speak if they'd like to, if they feel there's anything that needs to be added.
Would you like to add anything?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Soleimani. Chair, no, we have nothing further to add at this moment in time. I'm aware that this is still an ongoing criminal investigation, of which Mr. Perjurji has been cooperative with police regarding that and will be interviewed regarding the matter by our CID regarding this incident. But with regards to the licensing side of this, Mr. Soleimani has covered everything very succinctly from our perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. We now invite questions. So we start with questions from the premises. So, Mr. Dowding, do you have questions for Mr. Soleimani?
No questions. Thank you.
Okay. My fellow panel councillors, do you have questions for Mr. Soleimani? No, yes, Councillor Nagbal, yeah.
Just one, it's a point of clarification. So the report we received and the statement you've just given says that the defendant knocked the two gentlemen unconscious, but there's also been reference to stab wounds. I just wanted to understand as sort of how events transpired and how those stab wounds occurred. And
Chair, I can answer.
Yes.
Sorry, Mr. Soleimani.
No,
Chair, I can answer that for you. That assessment came from the LAS. When they attended and they dealt with the two subjects concerned, the one subject who had a laceration, they said was consistent with a stab wound. At that point, nobody has seen a knife or anything like that. It has been intimated. When you view the CCTV, there is no element of a knife being used at any point. So that was just something that the LAS crewmen intimated in terms of their perspective, and they just said a laceration that could be similar to that of a stab wound. So I think that is where that has emanated from, and that is my understanding, and that is on the initial incident, what we refer to as a CAD, which is where the call comes to police, and then we as police then respond according to that particular CAD, and then the ball starts to roll from then on in with regards to the procedures and the investigation element of the actual incident. I hope that clarifies the matter, ma'am.
thank you.
Thanks very much, Sergeant. I'd just like to ask one question of clarification. So yeah, in the evidence there were references to looking into entering the premises by force after the incident. I just wanted to clarify the timeline. So is your evidence, as you're saying, that the premises owner left shortly after the incident through the rear, so wasn't present when the police were trying to enter, or is there evidence that there was a period when he was inside the building and refusing to let the police in?
No, he's left out the back, literally gone into the premises after the assault, put the shutter down, and then as instantly left. He wasn't in there. CCTV shows what time he left the premises, and it was literally very soon after. Just kind of herding everyone out the back fire exit.
So the police didn't realise that until they saw the CCTV the next morning, but that's what happened, right? Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification. Right. So now I'm going to invite the premises to present their case. So, Mr. Dowding, would you like to present your case?
Thank you very much, Chair. So the events of the 19th of September were obviously extremely unfortunate, and we don't seek to sugarcoat what happened or to invite you to find anything other than that it was a serious incident. However, Mr. Perjurji wishes to make clear at the outset his relief that the two individuals involved have now made a recovery. And whilst it's no criticism at all of the police, we're all operating at this stage, at what is a very early stage of the investigation. The application, by necessity, given that it's a summary review, has been made at a point where the details are necessarily murky. And we've just seen two examples of that, with references to stuff that appears within the initial early papers, for example, references to a potential stab wound, later found out not to be a stab wound, references to persons being or police not being able to gain access to the buildings, and queries as to whether a person, the DPS, has left the building by that stage. All of this is unclear at this stage by necessity because of the early nature of the investigation. The picture is very much a movable feast. However, the important point is that it's now known clearly that this incident did not come as a bolt from the blue. And that's important because when you review the certificate served under section 53A, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this was simply an unprompted assault on a member of or two members of the public by Mr. Pajerge. That is simply not true, and you've just heard from the police themselves that there is a much wider context to this. There was a long build up to the incident, and this was an action by an individual who was effectively in the line of sight of two assailants who were repeatedly seeking to regain access to the premises after having been ejected. I'll come on to deal with that proper context in more detail momentarily, but if I may just start by outlining some details about the premises itself. The premises is a successful local business. It's one that's abided by all of the conditions imposed upon it in the past. And as I'll come on to, this incident arose precisely because Mr. Pajerge was seeking to enforce one of the conditions that this licensing subcommittee has placed onto its license. While it's a small venue, it is a very popular one. It's beloved by members of the local community. And I'm not sure the extent to which you're aware of the premises history, the application that it made, for example, for an extension to its licensing hours. But when it made that application, just shy of 500 members of the local area petitioned in support of the application. Unlike many local bars, this is a premises that has not been blighted to the same extent by antisocial behaviour. This is effectively the only incident which has ever led to a review of this nature before yourselves as a licensing subcommittee. It's important also to have in mind that this is a venue which employs 7 or 8 members of the local community as staff, all of whom will be without a job, without remuneration, without work in the event that the premises is closed. Indeed, as you'll be aware, for a small enterprise of this nature, the closure of the business, even for a short period of time, can have a devastating impact. Particularly, and I do invite you to have this well in mind when you make your decision, particularly a decision to suspend a licence, for example, when not all of the facts are clear and known. Caution needs to be taken at this early stage of proceedings before the final hearing has taken place. A final point in relation to the premises itself. The summary review, as you'll see from the dates if you're looking at the chronology, certificate was not issued, and today's hearing has not taken place until a number of days after the incident occurred. And in the intervening period, the premises has been operating. It's been cooperating with the investigation, and there have not been any further issues in relation to the premises. So that's another factor that we invite you to bear in mind when considering the nature of the summary review. There's 28 days, and then there will be a final hearing at which a decision will be made as to the future of the premises once all of the evidence is before you. The incident itself then, what is the proper context? I don't know if you have a copy of the licence in front of you. If not, it doesn't matter. I can read out. Oh, thank you very much. You'll see that condition 17 on the premises licence, I think it's paragraph 17, of the additional conditions which were added to the licence following the successful application for an extension of operating hours. It's at page 16 of the public reports pack, if that helps. It provides as follows: there shall be no admittance or readmittance to the premises 90 minutes prior to terminal hours, except on Sunday when the last entry will be at 11 p.m. Exception for smokers no longer needed as they will be within the licensed area. The 2 men who sustained injuries in this case had been repeatedly attempting to regain access to the premises. Mr. Pajerge and his staff had repeatedly informed them that they were not permitted to regain access to the premises because the time for licensable activities had passed. Police have now viewed the CCTV, as have I. I don't know whether you've had a copy of the actual footage or whether it could be played for you in some capacity today, but you've got a description of it, and I'll provide a description of it now. But in short, it's been acknowledged by the police at page 11 of the public reports pack that it's clear from the footage that members of the public, the 2 members of the public, were agitated and acting aggressively. They displayed consistent aggression, not only outside of the front of the premises, but for around 10 minutes whilst inside of the premises. One of them can be seen at one point throwing his arms wide and effectively, saying, "Come on then," to the various members of staff, challenging them seemingly to a fight. During the course of that, you can see Mr. Pajerge and a DJ who works at the premises attempting to de-escalate the situation. There is no violence used within the premises, and they successfully manage to eject the two members of the public from the premises, despite the persistent attempts by them to remain inside of its doors. Once they've got out of the premises, the members of staff continue to attempt to de-escalate. It's not simply the case, as has been suggested, that Mr. Pajerge leaves the front door of the premises and immediately punches one of the members of the public. That couldn't be further from the truth when you actually look at the CCTV. The one male who is the particular aggressor continues acting exactly as he has been previously. His friend initially attempts to calm him down. He sort of stands between the staff members and the member of the public, but he subsequently turns to face Mr. Pajerge and very much gets into his personal space. He too seems to grow agitated. As I say, it's simply not accurate to say that he comes out of the doorway, Mr. Pajerge, and immediately punches someone in the head. I'm not sure if my learned friend has seen the CCTV, but Mr. Pajerge was already outside of the premises attempting to de-escalate at that point in time. Within a matter of seconds after the initial discussion, after the friend has turned to face him, the main aggressor, the principal assailant, rushes swiftly towards Mr. Pajerge from around 5 or 6 feet away. He effectively runs at him. Mr. Pajerge punches him one time, knocking him down to the ground. He also punches the male next to him, who, as I say, is stood within about a foot of him and is appearing more and more aggressive as time goes on. He then walks back into the bar and the door is closed. Now, it's right to say that he leaves the premises through the rear, but it's important to note that there were members of the public, a number of young female members of the public within the premises at that time, who had been there whilst this incident involving violence had been ongoing. Mr. Pajerge escorts those members of the public out of the building through the rear, his principal concern at that time being for the remaining patrons. The panel will appreciate, and that's a brief summary of the CCTV. As I say, I have a copy of it. No doubt the police have too, so it can probably be shown to you if you wanted to see it. But that's a description of the CCTV. The panel will appreciate that the law is clear that when a person acts in self-defence or in defence of another, they have a lawful excuse to use violence. They are doing so, again, as the criminal law makes clear, with a split second to make a decision. And the law does not require a person to, the wording used, the sort of technical legal language used is way to a nicety at how much force can be used in a particular situation, because of course you're acting at a second's notice. When the aggressor ran towards Mr. Pajerge, he had a moment to react. Mr. Pajerge is SIA trained. He holds an SIA license. He took the decision in that moment that the best way to defend himself, the patrons inside the premises and his colleague stood next to him, was to throw a single punch. Now, Mr. Pajerge is a big gentleman. That punch clearly did knock the member of the public to the ground, but he didn't then go over and kick the member of the public. He didn't do anything else. He simply punched him, one single punch to the other male who was acting aggressively, and then went back inside. This was not, in my respectful submission, unreasonable force. And perhaps an understatement, but again, in my respectful submission, there is a strongly, powerfully arguable case that he was acting in lawful self-defence at that time. Now, of course, you're not here to determine the full facts today. I've simply provided that picture just to illustrate the fact that even though there's been a development, even though the police have provided additional evidence, having now viewed the CCTV, which has wholesale changed their initial perspective on the case, as you see from the certificate that was originally served. There are still further developments that will take place in the investigation. For example, the interview of Mr. Pajerge in due course, statements being taken from his two colleagues who were stood with him throughout the incident, and so on. And those will provide additional information about, for example, what words were used by the members of the public in the premises, how aggressively they were acting, because the CCTV doesn't capture the audio. But at this stage, I simply invite you to have in mind 3 important points from what I've said. The first is that even the police accept that Mr. Pajerge was not the aggressor during this incident. It appears patently clear that up until the very point at which the gentleman runs at him, he is using reasonable force to adopt the words of the police. He ejects the patrons from the premises, doing everything within his power to uphold the licensing conditions. It is only at the point where one of them assails him that he decides that he needs to take action. Secondly, there's a long build-up before the incident, as I've just described. And finally, as page 15 of the restricted bundle makes clear, Mr. Pajerge has cooperated with the investigation. He has provided the CCTV to the police and has agreed to attend a voluntary interview. And so with that context in mind, we come to the question that you have to decide today, and it is a simple one. What measures, if any measures, are necessary and proportionate in advance of the final review hearing? That hearing will take place in less than a month, and come what may, whether or not you impose interim steps, you will have the opportunity, once the full evidential picture is known, to make a final decision about this licence, whether or not to revoke it, to add conditions, to remove a DPS, and so on. The police are inviting you, before you have the full evidential picture, before that final hearing date, to suspend the licence. And the application appears to invite you to do so for two reasons. Firstly, because of the seriousness of the incident, as has been outlined by Mr. Soleimani, and secondly, because of a risk of reprisals, as is outlined within the bundle. With regard to the first issue, seriousness, when viewed in its proper context, as I've already outlined, there's a very compelling case that this was a person who was acting in self-defence or defence of another. It was an incident involving two members of the public acting aggressively towards him and his members of staff for a prolonged period of time. These are factors which considerably reduce the seriousness of Mr. Pajerge's actions, as does the fact that he was actively seeking to promote one of the conditions on his licence by ejecting those members of the public in the first place. With regard to the suggestion of reprisals, the second rationale, this is only applicable where there's actually some evidence before you that there is a risk of reprisals. The police have not suggested, for example, at any stage that the two members of the public are part of a gang or have threatened to return to the premises. Quite the contrary, they appear to be going through the proper channels, providing statements to the police and assisting with the investigation. There simply is no risk of reprisals in relation to the premises. I'm conscious, however, that the licensing subcommittee may wish to consider taking some action at this stage, and I'd invite you to consider measures short of a suspension for all of the reasons outlined, and bearing in mind the devastating impact which a suspension of the licence would have on the business and its employees. Parliament has given you an array of powers and a degree of flexibility when you consider what action is necessary and proportionate at this early stage. The first thing which I'll invite you to consider is that Mr. Pajerge has made clear that he's willing to give an undertaking not to be involved with the day-to-day management of the business until these proceedings have been finally determined. He will take a step back. Secondly, while Mr. Pajerge is SIA trained, as I've outlined, he would be content for a condition on the licence to be amended so that independent door staff only, and not Mr. Pajerge, are to be employed as SIA staff. In other words, are to be able to act at the premises as SIA staff. This would prevent him becoming involved in any matters involving disruption by customers or patrons moving forward. Second condition that could be added to the licence is an amendment to the condition relating to notification of police. At the moment, the notification condition only requires police to be notified where the incident occurs within the premises. We would invite you to extend that to incidents occurring in the immediate vicinity of the premises. Finally, although we ask you to consider this as a last resort, the removal of the DPS as an interim measure could be considered. The only reason I invite you to consider that as a last resort is simply that that would require at least a brief period whereby the premises could not operate for obvious reasons, because there'd have to be an application to add a new DPS. So there would still be a window within which it wouldn't be able to operate effectively and make money to pay its staff, etc. However, if you are considering that, I'd just like to highlight for you that an experienced potential DPS has already been identified. She works at the bar as a marketing manager, has done so for a period of time, and would be in a position to step in immediately in Mr. Pajerge's stead. So that's a final measure which we say could be considered short of suspension. Those are all the representations I'd make at this stage. I'm not going to invite Mr. Pajurje to speak unless you have particular questions for him, but as you'll appreciate, this is an ongoing investigation and he has an interview coming up very shortly. My intention is to do the speaking on behalf of the premises, but unless I can assist further at this stage.
Thank you, Mr. Dowding. As you're not calling a witness, we now move to questions to you. So does Mr. Soleimani first? Do you have questions for Mr. Dowding?
No questions at the moment, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Backlini and Councillor Nagpal, do you have questions? Yes. So Councillor Backlini.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to know why the applicant, sorry, Mr. Petrit, did not phone 999 regardless of the condition that states that he can only do so if the incident happened outside the premises, given the fact that there was a lot of danger that the two individuals gave to the. You said there was a female in the bar. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. As I've outlined, and again, I'm speaking on behalf of Mr. Pajurje now. It may well be that now that he knows the extent of the injuries, not calling 999 is something which he regrets. However, at the time, of course, what had happened over a period of a few seconds. He'd thrown the punches, turned around and locked the door and gone back inside, unaware of the specific condition that the members of the public were in. Once he'd got back inside, the CCTV shows clearly that other people are inside. And my understanding is that Mr. Pajurje's primary concern was to get those people out of the premises and not to get them out by the front door where the two men still were. It's difficult to understate how aggressive those two men were being during the course of their interactions within the bar. And had they not been in the condition that they were in, they may well have still posed a risk to members of the public within the bar. So I hope that satisfactorily answers it. As I say, it's difficult for Mr. Pajurje to speak now because he still has an interview upcoming. That would be the appropriate place for him to give a full account.
Okay, Councillor Backlini, do you have further questions? What was that?
I do have another one. About yes, Mr. Petrit was the SIA as well, so he was the license holder and the DPS and the SIA.
So they have a company that they use independently, which does employ SIA. So, for example, some nights they're required to have two there, some they're required to have one. My understanding is that Mr. Pajurje doesn't formally act as an SIA. He has a license and he obtained that license to provide support to his staff. And for example, if an SIA member called in sick or was unable to attend, he would be able to fill that role. So the point being made is that he holds an SIA license, but he doesn't regularly act as an SIA at his own premises.
Okay, thank you for the explanation. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Great. And Councillor Nagpal.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Dowding, I appreciate that you may not be able to speak on behalf of Mr. Pajurje regarding this, but I want to understand why Mr. Pajurje felt the need to de-escalate outside the premises rather than just close the doors at that point. And if you could give me some idea of how long he was attempting to de-escalate outside, if it was a matter of seconds or if it was a number of minutes, that would help us understand a little bit more context about what happened. Thank you.
Of course, absolutely. So I'm just getting the footage up in front of me now so that I can give you a slightly more accurate timeline in relation to what happens outside of the premises. I don't want to give you inaccurate information. So after they've left the premises, there's approximately a minute where members, effectively, they're talking in the doorway. So the two members of the public are very much in the doorway with Mr. Pajurje and his other members of staff, and you can see them. One of them reaches out and sort of pushes, tries to regain access. Mr. Pajurje and his colleague are trying to attempt them to get access by blocking the door. So they're standing in the doorway, stopping them from coming back in. At that stage, it doesn't look as though it's possible for them to close the door, because if, for example, they'd turned around and gone back into the premises, it looks as though they would have simply been followed. So what they seem to be trying to do is effectively to talk the two men down and to keep them outside of the premises where the other members of the public were present. After a period of the sort of pushing and shoving by the two members of the public, Mr. Pajurje and his DJ, the other gentleman who's present, move outside of the premises and attempt to try to restrain or stop the two members of the public from acting in the way that they are. The DJ seems to be restraining one of them against the side of the premises. And during this period of time, Mr. Bergerget has his arms out in front of him, effectively seeming to try to calm down the situation. It's around a minute later that we see the main aggressor, so the member of the public, sort of walk round from behind the two men. So he's sort of been moved back to where the pavement area is. He walks around behind the two men, straight up to Mr. Bergerget, and is then punched. So to answer your question, there's approximately a minute of attempts to de-escalate and not to allow them back into the premises. Lots of gesticulating by all parties involved. And then at the end of that minute, the male walks up to Mr. Bergerget and is punched. Does that assist? I appreciate it's very difficult because we're not showing you the footage, so it's hard for me to describe it and for you to have an image in your mind.
Yeah, well, sorry, just to clarify, 1 minute in the doorway and then 1 minute outside.
No, sorry. So inside of the premises, there's a significant amount of time during which this sort of incident or altercation is ongoing. In terms of when they're in the doorway, the argument in the doorway seems to be going on for it's very difficult to say. So it actually seems to be going on for around 3 to 4 minutes when I look at the interior footage. The footage I was looking at before was the camera that's above the doorway. So what happens is around 9 minutes into a 13-minute clip, the men move outside of the doorway. The argument continues. And then at around 9 minutes 40 into a 13-minute clip, the front door is closed so that the members of the public remain inside. And then you can't see anything more from the inside camera. But when you look at the outside camera, you see what I was describing before. So all of the men in the doorway, lots of gesticulating, lots of talking. And then at the very end of the clip is when you see the punch.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this, quite sure who this is a question for, but would it be possible for the panel to see the CCTV footage? Is that something that could be technically made to happen?
I mean, I suppose the only consideration, certainly for my part, and I imagine from Mr. Soleimani as well, would be that given the ongoing nature of the investigation, it may well be appropriate to go into private session if that's going to take place, because this would, of course, be evidence in that investigation.
Sergeant Kassan.
Chair, if I may interject, I completely concur with Mr. Dowding's representation with regards to the CCTV. If we could please show this, if you do require it, behind closed doors, as this is an ongoing investigation. And if we did put it on this public forum, it does compromise everything, both for the defence and the prosecution. So I would kindly ask if we could consider that, please. But obviously we will take your following and your guidance with regards to this, sir. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Okay, well, I mean, certainly I'm sure it would be fine for us to stop the stream if we're going to do it. In terms of just the technicalities of it, are we able, has somebody got it on their screen and they could screen share if we can, if we stop? Yeah, so
yeah, I think we can try.
Okay, so just checking with Ms. Davis, who's our legal advisor, is that legally okay for us to stop the live stream and see the CCTV in private?
Yes, it is, Chair. If you consider that these matters might prejudice an ongoing investigation, then it is certainly allowable for you to do that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So Sean, if you can stop the stream and we will look at that and then we'll return to public session afterwards.